The candles at Cane House had been lit for 3 hours by the time Lady Dorothea made her observation, and the dining room was bright enough that no one could claim they had not heard it. 30 guests at a table draped in white linen, the chandelier throwing its light across silver and crystal, and the very particular arrangement of faces that Lady Dorothea Kane considered the county's proper society. The Hartwell girl was seated 2 places from the Earl of Stern, her ivory gown catching the candlelight in a way that seemed deliberate. The Earl himself sat at the far end of the table from his hostess, his dark head inclined over his wine, his expression carrying that quality of careful neutrality that his neighbors had long since stopped trying to read. And at the lower end of the table, in a chair positioned with the faint but unmistakable geometry of afterthought, sat a woman in black. She was not young in the way Miss Hartwell was young, all surface and season and the frank announcement of availability. She was 25 years old, and she wore it the way women wear a year of grief, not as age, but as weight, the kind that settles differently in the eyes than in the face. Her gown was plain wool crepe, well made, but long past its freshness, and she sat very still among the satins and jewels of Lady Dorothea's table, as though stillness were the only courtesy left to offer. Lady Dorothea had addressed the Earl at that moment, something about an estate matter, the tone impeccably social. And then, because Lady Dorothea was precise in all things, she had added the qualification that made the table go briefly quiet. "Of course," she said, "one must make allowances for the baronet's widow." The words were polite. They were devastating. They named nothing in particular and reduced everything at once. Cecily Ashworth heard them. She had been hearing them, in one form or another, for the past 12 months. She did not look up from her plate. She had developed, over the past year, a careful practice of absolute stillness in moments like this. She kept her gaze on the arrangement of cutlery before her, on the white linen, on the small dish of dressed greens she had not touched. She was aware of the footman at the wall. She was aware of the woman in pink 2 chairs to her right, who had made a small involuntary sound at Lady Dorothea's words. Not a laugh, but something adjacent. She was aware of the particular quality of silence that settles over a table when every person at it has just been given permission to think something and has decided to think it quietly. What she did not allow herself was to look at the far end of the table, toward the dark-haired man whose presence at that gathering had given her, she admitted now, a foolish and unexamined fraction of hope that tonight might pass without event. Julian Mercer, the Earl of Stern, lifted his eyes from his wine-glass at that moment and looked down the length of the table at the woman in black. His face did not change. Nothing in his posture shifted. He held his gaze on her for the space of perhaps 5 seconds, no more, and then returned his attention to his hostess. What he had seen, no one at that table could say. What Cecily did not yet know was that he had seen the thing she had been keeping hidden for a year. She had moved to Wiltshire the previous October, 3 weeks after the funeral, and 2 weeks after the creditor's man had come to the London house to begin his inventory. The baronet had left her £400, a leased cottage outside the village of Norham, the debts, which were substantial, and a name that was no longer her own in any sense that mattered. She had been born Cecily Fairfax, the only daughter of the late Viscount Fairfax of Heatherton. She had married Sir Edmund Ashworth at 19 because her father had shaken hands on the arrangement, and she had not wished to shame him, and because she had not been wise enough at 19 to understand the difference between a man who found her useful and a man who found her. 6 years later, her father was dead, and her husband was dead, and she was in a cottage in Wiltshire, sorting through the remnants with the careful thoroughness that was the only dignity left to her. Mrs. Ruth Daly had found her there. Ruth had been her father's housekeeper at Heatherton for 20 years, and when the estate had been sealed pending probate, the entail a complicated matter contested by a distant cousin and caught in chancery, and Ruth had come quietly to the village and taken a room above the milliner's, because she could not quite bring herself to go elsewhere. She arrived at the cottage door one morning in November, carrying a pot of soup and the particular expression of a woman who intends to say nothing about what she has seen and everything about what she intends to do about it. The brooch had been Ruth's idea, or rather Ruth's insistence. It had belonged to Cecily's mother, a small oval of white enamel set with the Fairfax crest in gold and lapis, a running hair above 3 silver stars, the motto in lettering fine enough to require nearness to read. Cecily had kept it in a box since her father's death, meaning to sell it when the worst came. Ruth had found it in the box and had pressed it into Cecily's hand with a look that did not require elaboration. "Pin it inside your collar," Ruth had said. "Not outside. Pin it all the same." Cecily had not asked what Ruth meant by the distinction. She understood well enough. She pinned the brooch at the inside of her collar, against the plain linen, and she wore it every day as the only thing that remained of who she had been before the world decided she was someone else entirely. The invitation to Cane House had come in January, and it had not been, strictly speaking, an invitation. Lady Dorothea had written to inform her that there was a matter regarding Sir Edmund's outstanding account at the Cane Estates home farm, a small debt, 30 shillings, the kind of thing the baronet had accumulated everywhere he went, and which his widow was now, apparently, expected to remedy. The letter was correct in every detail, and managed nonetheless to communicate exactly what Lady Dorothea thought of her correspondent. Cecily read it twice, set it down, read it a third time, and then wrote back to say that she would call on Tuesday to review the account and that she would bring the relevant papers. She arrived at Cane House on a Tuesday afternoon in January. The ground frozen, her boots leaving precise marks in the gravel of the entrance path. The footman who admitted her held the door with the particular blankness of a servant whose instructions regarding the visitor were clear. She was shown not to the drawing room, but to a small anteroom near the kitchens, which communicated Lady Dorothea's intentions with a completeness that left nothing to interpretation. She had been sitting there perhaps 10 minutes when she heard Lady Dorothea's voice in the vestibule, accompanied by the lighter voice of Miss Eugenia Hartwell. "She has written again about the account," Lady Dorothea was saying. "I shall be brief with her. The baronet's widow has very little standing to negotiate anything, and she ought to understand that clearly before the matter proceeds." A murmur of assent from Miss Hartwell, or something close enough to assent. "The account will be settled today," Lady Dorothea continued, "and I shall make clear that further correspondence is unnecessary. She is not of this county in any meaningful sense." Cecily sat very still in the cold anteroom and listened to the fire in the distant grate, and thought about the £18 remaining in the tin box beneath her bed. She smoothed the papers in her lap, which did not require smoothing. She waited. She was there to settle an account. She would settle it. What she had not expected was the library. The account was dispensed with quickly enough. Lady Dorothea received her in a morning room, reviewed the papers with the efficiency of a woman conducting a business transaction rather than a social call, accepted the 30 shillings, and indicated with a turn of her head that the interview was concluded. Cecily gathered her papers and was moving back along the east corridor toward the entrance when she realized she had taken the wrong turning. The east corridor at Cane House opened onto the library. The door stood half ajar, and through it came the smell of coal smoke and old leather, and something else. Pipe tobacco very faint, and years old perhaps, and absorbed into the woodwork. Cecily paused because the corridor was unfamiliar, and she needed a moment to determine the correct direction, and in that pause, she heard movement inside the room. She had pushed the door another inch to look for a footman to direct her, when she found herself looking instead at Julian Mercer. He was standing at the far wall with his back to the door, examining what appeared to be a property map spread across the reading table. He had shed his coat and stood in his waistcoat, one hand at the table's edge, his attention entirely on the map in front of him. He was taller than she had judged from across the cane dinner table, and the line of his back had that particular quality of discipline she had noticed before. Not rigidity, but control. The difference between a man who holds himself because he must, and one who holds himself because he has decided to. She said nothing. She should have stepped back and found another route, and considered the matter closed. He turned. He looked at her for a moment in the manner of a man who does not visibly revise his expectations. The room was warm, warmer than the corridor, and it smelled of beeswax and the cold February air that had come in when he entered earlier, and that combination was oddly specific in a way she could not account for. A fire burned in the grate to his left. The map on the reading table behind him was edged with the marks of considerable study, multiple marks in pencil, several lines inked. She registered these details as a person. Registers details when they are trying to not register the person in front of them. Then he said, "The entrance hall is to your left and through the green baize door." "Thank you," Cecily said. She did not move immediately, which she could not afterwards entirely account for. He was still looking at her, with an expression that gave away nothing except possibly the faint acknowledgement that she had not moved. "You are Lady Dorothea's guest," he said. It was not quite a question. "I came to settle an account," she said, "on behalf of my late husband's estate." Something shifted in his expression, very briefly. He looked back at the map. "I see. I believe you saw me at Lady Dorothea's table 3 weeks ago," she said, which was not a statement she had intended to make. But the small anteroom and the cold walk and the 30 shillings were still very present in her chest, and she found she did not wish to be managed out of the room before she had said at least one honest sentence. He looked back at her then. His eyes were dark gray, the color of river water in February. They stayed on her face for a moment with an attention that felt, oddly, like weighing. "I did," he said. "Then you have heard Lady Dorothea's summary of my situation," Cecily said. "I shall not trouble you to revise it. The entrance hall is to the left." She turned. "It is to the left and through the baize door," he said behind her. "Not left and straight on. That leads to the cellar steps." She paused. "Thank you," she said again, and went. She did not look back. She was aware, in the particular way the body records things the mind has not yet named, of the quality of attention at her back as she left the room. The following week she was in the kitchen garden behind the cottage when she became aware that she was not alone. She had not come to the kitchen garden for any reason that would have been legible to an observer. She had come because Mrs. Nellie Garvey, the laborer's wife from the East Field, had sent her eldest boy around the previous evening with a handwritten note explaining that she had nothing left to send in repayment of the several household items she had borrowed during Sir Edmund's last illness: the good linens, a copper pan, 2 bolts of flannel. Cecily had written back immediately to say that there was nothing to repay and that the items had been left as a gift. Mrs. Garvey had written again to say she could not accept that. Cecily had gathered the items that morning and carried them herself to the kitchen gate of the Garvey cottage, which was nearer than it looked from the lane. She had thought no one was watching. She handed the basket to Mrs. Garvey at the gate and said that it was a matter of no consequence, and she should not mention it to anyone. And Mrs. Garvey, who was practical and cold and had 3 children to manage, had taken the basket and pressed Cecily's hand once and gone back inside without ceremony. When Cecily turned, Lord Stern was standing at the far end of the kitchen garden path. He was not looking at her directly. He was examining the frost on a low stone wall with the careful attention of a man who has decided to examine it. He wore a dark riding coat, and his hat was in his hand, which meant he had been there long enough to remove it, or had removed it for reasons of his own. He had, she realized, a very good capacity for stillness. She waited for him to say something cutting. The baronet's widow, on an errand of charity, was perhaps what he was composing. He said nothing. She walked toward the gate at the end of the path, and because the path was narrow and he was standing at its end, she would have to pass within a few feet of him. She kept her eyes forward. As she passed, her shawl caught on the low branch of the espaliered pear tree at the gatepost, and she reached up to free it. And in the reaching, the collar of her gown pulled back, and the morning light found the small oval of enamel pinned inside it. She freed the shawl. She did not look at him. "Miss Ashworth," he said. She stopped. His voice carried a quality she had not heard in it before, something careful. "Your shawl," he said. "The fringe." She looked down. One end of the fringe had caught a second time in the gate latch. She worked it free, thanked him without looking at his face, and walked back to the cottage. She did not know what he had seen. She thought, possibly, that he had seen the brooch. She thought he probably had no idea what it meant. She walked back to the cottage by the long way, through the lane, rather than across the field, because she needed the time. Her hands were cold where the shawl had been insufficient to the February air, and her left heel had begun to tell on the uneven ground. She had been going to think about the basket and Mrs. Garvey and the small, uncomplicated satisfaction of that errand, but she found she was thinking instead about a man standing at a stone wall with his hat in his hand, attending to the frost with an attention it had not earned on its own merits. She did not understand him. She had spent a year learning to take people at their social surface, because the surface was generally all she was offered and all she had any right to ask for. And Lord Stern's surface said clearly that he was a man of rank and precision who found sentiment tedious and widows tiresome. His surface and his reputation agreed. The space between the surface and the man who had stood at the end of a garden path with his hat in his hand was not something she had the means to navigate. She let herself into the cottage and set the kettle on, and told herself firmly that she had imagined any significance in it. She was wrong on the second count. That same week, though she did not know it, Lord Stern rode east to Heatherton. He had known of the Fairfax estate in the abstract, a minor viscountcy, the holder recently dead, the entail in dispute. It was the kind of chancery matter that solicitors managed and peers were only occasionally called to witness. He had seen the crest on the enamel brooch, and he knew the Fairfax crest because he had dined with the late Viscount Fairfax twice, years ago, and the old man had worn the signet ring with the running hair. He found Mr. Clement Holt in the estate office at Heatherton, a meticulous man in a brown coat who had been managing the Fairfax affairs for 11 years and who explained, with the careful precision of his profession, that the estate could not pass to Miss Cecily Fairfax because she had taken the name Ashworth upon her marriage some months before the Viscount's death, and the original entail contained a clause regarding the preservation of the name that her marriage had technically voided. The distant cousin's claim was legally sound. The cousin had offered Miss Cecily, using the name deliberately, a settlement of £200 and the contents of one room. She had not replied to his letter. Julian rode back to Wiltshire in the early dark and sat in his study for a long time before the fire. He did not look at the portrait of his brother that hung on the study wall, though he was aware of it in the way he was always aware of it, a thing that occupied the peripheral edge of every decision he made in that room. His brother had been 31 when the carriage wheel broke. He had been alone on the road because Julian had decided, that particular morning, that he preferred to ride. It was a small decision. It had cost everything. Julian had spent 8 years making only the decisions that could be defended, only the choices that could be justified on paper, only the acts whose consequences he could trace in advance. He had managed his estate with precision and his social obligations with discipline and his own desires with a thoroughness that had begun, in recent years, to feel less like self-command and more like burial. He sat before the fire, and he thought about a woman who had married a foolish man at 19 because her father had already given his word, who had carried a crest inside her collar for a year rather than invoke it, who had walked to a laborer's wife's gate with a basket of linens and asked for nothing in acknowledgement. He thought about the 30 shillings. He thought about the anteroom near the kitchen where she had been placed to wait, and the careful straightness of her spine in that chair, and the way she had come into the library not as someone who wanted anything from him, but as someone navigating toward an exit, and momentarily delayed. He thought about what it cost a woman of her quality to settle a 30-shilling account on behalf of the man who had ruined her, with composure and without apology. He sat there for a long time. When he finally looked at the portrait, he looked at it directly for the first time in perhaps 2 years. His brother's face, rendered in oils at 30 years old, a year before the accident. An open face, a generous one. The painter had caught something of the ease that Thomas had always had, the ease that Julian had always lacked, and had privately envied, and now privately mourned as a quality he had not known to value until it was gone. He had told himself for 8 years that care and precision were the correct response to grief, that choosing carefully, acting only on certainty, never committing himself to anything he could not control, was a form of fidelity to his brother's memory. He was not certain of that anymore. When he rose, he went to his writing table and sent a note to Holt. Then he sent another to Lady Dorothea, declining her dinner for the following Saturday, the invitation to which he had already agreed. He did not explain either note. He had decided something. He was not yet prepared to name it aloud, because naming it aloud made it irrevocable, and irrevocable things required certainty, and certainty required. And he sat down again. Certainty required that he had seen what he thought he had seen in the kitchen garden. He had. Lady Dorothea's dinner on the following Saturday proceeded without Lord Sterne, and without, presumably, any knowledge of what had passed at Heatherton. What it did not proceed without was Lady Dorothea's full attention to the matter she had been managing since the autumn. She had written to Cecily again. This time the letter was not about an account. Cecily read it twice at the cottage kitchen table, with Ruth Daly standing at the window pretending to look at the lane. The letter informed her that a creditor of Sir Edmund's had communicated to Lady Dorothea a matter of some public interest, specifically that the late baronet's solicitor had confirmed that his widow had been made aware of the full extent of the debts 1 week before the wedding, and had proceeded with the marriage without informing either her father or the baronet's family. The letter asked, with polished courtesy, whether Miss Ashworth would care to address this matter at a small gathering on Thursday evening, before it became more widely discussed. There was, Cecily recognized with the particular clarity of a woman who has been here before, no safe answer to such a letter. She could decline and be spoken of as a coward. She could attend and be spoken of in person. She attended. The gathering was not small. 30 people in the drawing room of Kane House, the best of the county's winter society, Miss Hartwell in pale rose at the pianoforte. Cecily arrived in her black wool gown and took a chair near the window and waited. She did not have to wait long. Lady Dorothea raised the matter with the social precision of a surgeon. She did not introduce it clumsily. She allowed it to arise naturally from a discussion of estate management. And then she turned to Cecily with the expression of a woman exercising only the mildest curiosity. "I confess," she said, in a voice that carried comfortably to every corner of the room, "that I cannot quite understand why a young woman in full knowledge of her husband's circumstances would choose to proceed with such a marriage. One cannot help but wonder whether the baronet's widow was perhaps better served by the connection than she has wished to admit." The room did not go quiet. It went careful, which was worse. Cecily looked at her hands in her lap. She had known this moment would come, had known it since the letter arrived, and she had prepared for it by deciding that she would say the exact truth, which was the only thing she had that Lady Dorothea could not take from her. "I knew of the debts," Cecily said. "I was told a week before the wedding. My father had already given his word, and he was not a man who retracted his given word." She looked up. "I made a choice that protected his honor at the cost of my own security. I regret several things about that choice. I do not regret that I made it." Lady Dorothea's expression suggested she found this account prettily arranged. "Still," Lady Dorothea said, with the particular softness of the final blow, "there is a kind of calculation in that one cannot quite admire." The room absorbed this. Cecily sat perfectly still. Lord Sterne was not in the room. He had declined the invitation. She had noted his absence when she arrived, with the precise mental movement of a woman who has decided not to note a thing and notes it anyway. She understood now that his absence was his answer, and she understood that she had not, after all, learned anything she had not already known. The world would always find the calculation in an honest act if it was looking for one. She had been a fool to hope otherwise. She did not leave. That would have been a different kind of defeat. She sat until a decent interval had passed. She heard the conversation resume around her, which it did within perhaps 2 minutes, because a drawing room in the county's winter season has no choice but to keep moving. She accepted a cup of tea from the footman and set it down untouched, and watched the fire in the grate, and thought, with great thoroughness, about nothing at all. When she finally rose, she made her excuses to Lady Dorothea, who received them with grace and offered a smile that communicated a species of satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. Cecily thanked her for the evening. She collected her shawl from the footman in the hall, the same plain shawl she had worn to every gathering this winter, and she walked out into the cold. It was 3 weeks later that she came to Kane House for the last time. She came on a Tuesday again, having a way of returning to Tuesdays as though they owed her something, carrying the account ledger that she had agreed to review on behalf of the estate. She had spoken with the baronet's solicitor. She had found a final discrepancy, and she had promised Mr. Holt that she would deliver the corrected records to Kane House before the month's end so that the estate account could be formally closed. She had not known that Lady Dorothea had arranged a morning gathering. The drawing room was full when the footman opened the door. 20 persons, perhaps more, the same county winter society that had witnessed the Thursday dinner. Cecily stood in the doorway with the ledger under her arm and understood in one clear moment exactly why she had been admitted rather than turned away at the entrance. She had been expected. Lady Dorothea came forward, and the room settled behind her into the attentive stillness of a crowd that has been waiting. "Miss Ashworth," Lady Dorothea said, the name a slight correction in itself. "How good of you to come. We were just speaking of the Ashworth estate's final settlement. I believe you have the account records." The room watched. Cecily looked at her, and then at the room. And then she set the ledger down on the table near the door with a care and precision that she hoped communicated everything she intended. "The records are complete," she said. "The account is closed." "Yes," Lady Dorothea said pleasantly. "And so, I think, is the matter of the baronet's widow's business in this county. I understand you are considering a removal to Bath." She had not told anyone she was considering a removal to Bath. The room was very quiet. The door behind her opened. She heard 2 sets of footsteps, one familiar and measured, the particular cadence she had been aware of in the kitchen garden, and one shorter, quicker, the sound of a man in a hurry. Julian Mercer stepped into the room. Mr. Clement Holt was behind him, carrying a leather document case. Lord Stern did not look at Lady Dorothea when he entered. He looked at Cecily. She was standing very still near the table, the ledger at her side, her collar closed at her throat, the black wool gown plain as a declaration. He looked at her face for a moment, and something in his expression changed. Not the controlled neutrality she had come to expect, but something quieter and more costly. Something that had been held back for weeks and was now permitted, simply, to be visible. He crossed the room. The room did not move. The crowd did the thing that crowds do in the Regency drawing rooms of England. They became a witness, whether they intended to or not. He stopped 3 feet from her. "Miss Cecily Fairfax," he said in a voice that was level and clear, and carried without effort to every corner of the room. "And I intend to offer for her." The line fell into silence. Lady Dorothea's fan stopped moving in her hand. Miss Hartwell, at the pianoforte, looked up from the keys. The crowd redistributed itself in the particular way of people who have just understood that the scene they were prepared to witness is not the scene they are in. Holt stepped forward and opened the document case. He extracted a folded paper and laid it on the table beside the ledger. And he said, with the careful satisfaction of a man delivering a long-held document to its rightful moment, that he had in his possession a codicil to the late Viscount Fairfax's will, properly witnessed and sealed, which named his daughter Cecily Fairfax Ashworth as sole heir to the Heatherton estate, the entail's name clause notwithstanding, provided the contested chancery matter could be cleared, and that Lord Stern had agreed to serve as the legal guarantee of that clearing, having applied to the Chancery Court 3 days prior. The room absorbed this. Lady Dorothea said something, to no one in particular, and then stopped. Her voice had the particular quality of a woman who has prepared a very precise social instrument and found the target gone. Cecily looked at Julian. He was still 3 feet from her. His face was not cold. She was not sure she had ever understood before that the coldness was the control, and not the man. That under the careful neutrality there was something that had been waiting, patient as groundwater, for a reason to rise. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a question with an answer she thought she already had. "I rode to Heatherton 4 weeks ago," he said, "when I saw the Crest." She did not move immediately. She was thinking about a kitchen garden and a shawl and a pear tree, and the quality of light on a small piece of enamel. She was thinking about 30 shillings and a small anteroom and a footman's instructions and a woman sitting alone at a table with her hands in her lap. "You said nothing," she said. "I needed to be certain of what I intended before I spoke," he said. "I am not a man who speaks before he is certain." I am aware that this has certain costs. She looked at him for a long time. You are very sure of yourself, she said, which was not quite what she meant, but it was close. I am sure of you, he said. That is the part I needed to be certain of. Miss Hartwell rose quietly from the pianoforte. She gathered her gloves and she said something soft to the woman beside her, and she crossed the room to the door without looking at Lord Stern. And it was not retreat, so much as the clean withdrawal of a woman who has understood the situation with clarity and chosen her own dignity. Lady Dorothea stood for another moment, and then she sat, very precisely, in the nearest chair. Her posture remained correct. She said nothing further. It was, Cecily thought, the most honest thing she had ever seen her do. The room began to breathe again, in ones and twos, the careful resumption of ordinary movement that follows a stillness of that weight. Cecily looked down at the ledger on the table, and then at Holt's document beside it. And then she looked back at Julian, who was still standing 3 feet from her, with the expression of a man who has committed himself and is now waiting, entirely still, for the consequence. She reached up with steady hands and unfastened the first button of her collar. She unclipped the Fairfax brooch from its inner position and held it for a moment in her palm, the white enamel and the running hair and the 3 silver stars. And then she pinned it to the outside of her collar, at the throat, where the light could find it. She met his eyes. You may speak to Mr. Holt, she said, about the matter of the estate. We can discuss the other matter after. His expression did something then that she had not seen it do before, and suspected very few people had ever witnessed. The control was still present, always present, but beneath it and through it, there was warmth, a very particular warmth, the kind that has been waiting in a cold room for a long time and has finally been given permission to show itself. Yes, he said. We can. He said it the way he said all his short declarative sentences, level and plain, and she had learned by then to hear the full weight of what the economy contained. The month that followed was not simple. Chancery matters are never simple, and a woman who had spent 6 years as the baronet's widow did not become Miss Cecily Fairfax again in a morning. There were papers, and there was Holt, who was meticulous, and there was a distant cousin who received a settlement and departed without excessive ceremony. There were the £200 from the cottage's remaining furniture, which turned out not to be needed, and there was a conversation with Ruth Daly that went on for 2 hours in the cottage kitchen and involved, at various points, soup. Julian came to the cottage on a Tuesday in February, which had by then established itself as the only day that seemed to carry any weight. He came in the early evening, when the last of the light was going from the lane. Ruth had contrived to be visiting her milliner, which was not a subtlety, but was kindly meant. The fire in the parlor was lit, and Cecily had not moved her chair from its position near it, and the brooch was pinned at the outside of her collar, as it had been every day since the drawing-room. He sat across from her, and they spoke for a long time about things that mattered, which is to say things that were specific and difficult, and required honesty on both sides. He told her about his brother and the morning in September 8 years ago, when he had decided to ride. He told it in the way he told all things, plainly, with no performance of grief. And she heard the full weight of it, and did not try to diminish it, because it did not require diminishment. It required witness. She told him about 19 and her father, and the week before the wedding. And he listened in the way he did all things, with complete and undeflected attention, and he did not try to tell her that she had been right or wrong, because that was not what the telling required. What it required, they both seemed to understand, was simply to be heard. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the parlor window, the first snow of the year had begun, falling quietly on the lane and the frozen kitchen garden and the stone wall where she had stood on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago with a basket of linens and expected nothing. "I should tell you," he said at some point in his level way, "that I am not easy company. I am generally considered cold, and I am informed that I have a tendency to speak plainly when something more graceful is expected. I am generally considered a widow with an inconvenient history," she said. "We shall make very good company for each other." The corner of his mouth moved. She had learned to watch for that movement. She looked down at the brooch at her collar, the running hair and the 3 silver stars and the motto in letters so fine you had to come close to read it. Outside, the snow had thickened to a quiet, white, steady fall. She could see through the parlor window, the lane going white, and the dark shape of his horse at the gate, patient and still. A man who could stand at a stone wall in a kitchen garden and wait without explanation could apparently manage a horse that did the same. She had kept it inside her collar for a year, because that was what the world required of her. She had worn it outside for 3 weeks now, because she had decided that whatever the world required next, she would face it as her father's daughter, which was what she had always been. Ruth came back from the milliner's at 8 o'clock and found Lord Stern's horse still at the gate and the parlor fire still lit, and she stood for a moment in the cold of the entrance and listened to the quiet voices inside and the snow on the window, and she went to the kitchen and made tea and said nothing at all, which was, perhaps, the most eloquent thing she had ever done. The hair ran across the white enamel, the 3 stars steady above it, and the fire was warm, and the snow fell without sound on the lane outside the window of a house that was, at last, beginning to be a home. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments. We are grateful for every one of them.